The sun was sinking fast behind the ridgeline when Jacob Brennan saw the smoke rising from the gulch below. He'd been riding the northern boundary of his land for hours, checking fence lines and water sources, when that thin gray column caught his eye. At first, he thought it might be a campfire. Travelers sometimes cut through his property without asking. But something about the way the smoke twisted made him uneasy. It was too thick, too dark, and it carried the smell of burning wood mixed with something sharper. He urged his horse forward, picking his way down the rocky slope as the light began to fade. The closer he got, the louder the crackling became, and by the time he reached the floor of the gulch, he could see flames licking up from what looked like an overturned supply wagon wedged between two boulders. The fire had already consumed most of the canvas cover, and the wooden frame was beginning to buckle. But it wasn't the wagon itself that stopped Jacob cold. It was a woman chained to it. She was enormous, taller than any person he'd ever seen. Her body sprawled across the fractured bed of the wagon, wrists and ankles bound by iron restraints hammered deep into the charred wood. Her clothes were scorched, her face streaked with soot and blood, and she wasn't moving. Jacob didn't hesitate. He dropped from his saddle, grabbed the old pry bar he kept strapped to his saddle pack, and rushed toward the flames. She woke just before dawn, lying on a pile of horse blankets in the corner of his barn. Jacob had dragged her there after prying the last shackle free. His hands blistered from the heat, his shirt soaked through with sweat and ash. He'd been sitting on an overturned bucket near the door, keeping watch, when her eyes snapped open. There was no grogginess, no slow return to consciousness, just instant alertness, like a wild animal sensing a trap. She sat up too fast, wincing as the movement pulled at burns along her ribs, and when Jacob stood to offer her water from the canteen in his hand, she turned her head away. He set it down beside her anyway. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she braced one hand against the nearest support beam and tried to push herself to her feet. The wood groaned under her palm, and then it splintered, not from rut, but from the sheer pressure of her grip. She stared at the broken post for a moment, breathing hard, then limped toward the barn door without a word. Jacob followed at a distance, unsure whether to help or stay back. When she stepped into the yard, the cool morning air seemed to hit her all at once. Her legs buckled, and she went down on one knee, coughing violently, deep, rattling sounds that came from lungs still thick with smoke. Jacob moved toward her, but she raised one hand to stop him, palm out, head down. He waited. When the coughing finally subsided, she lifted her face toward him, and her voice came out low and rough. "If they find me here," she said, each word deliberate, "you will die." The riders came with the sunrise. Jacob heard them before he saw them, hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls, slow and deliberate. He stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand but lowered, and watched as two figures crested the ridge. The lead rider was older, his face carved deep with lines that spoke of decades under the sun. He sat tall despite his age, wrapped in a worn blanket that draped across his shoulders like a mantle. The younger man beside him, a scout, judging by the way his eyes swept the land, held back as the elder dismounted. There was no hostility in his approach, no raised weapons, no demands, just a heaviness that Jacob agreed, though every instinct told him this was a mistake. They left within the hour, taking only what could fit in saddlebags: water, dried meat, a blanket, and Jacob's rifle. She rode behind him on his strongest horse, silent for the first few miles as they moved west through open scrubland. The sun climbed higher, and the land stretched out flat and unforgiving ahead of them. It wasn't until they stopped to rest the horses that she finally spoke. "I was born this way," she said, staring out at the horizon. "Taller than my mother by the time I was 10. Stronger than the men by 12. Some called it a gift. Others called it a curse." She paused, her voice quieter now. "The elders said I was an omen, that the spirits had marked me for something. But all it did was make me different. Alone." Jacob didn't know what to say, so he just listened. She told him about the bounty hunters, how they'd come at night, not for tribal reasons, but because word of her size had spread through trading posts and saloons. Men saw her as a spectacle, something they could cage and profit from. She'd been hunting alone when they found her, trying to prove she didn't need protection. I should have stayed with the others, she said, her jaw tight. I thought I could handle myself. By the second day, they reached the river crossing near the Federal Survey Trail. Jacob spotted the blue uniforms before they cleared the trees. 3 soldiers watering their horses, a canvas tent pitched nearby. He considered turning back, but the woman had already been seen. One of the soldiers, a young officer with a thin mustache, stepped forward and raised his hand. "Hold there," he called out. Jacob reined in his horse, keeping his expression calm. "Just passing through." The officer's eyes moved to the woman, lingering on her height, her burns, her Apache features. "She with you?" "Hired hand," Jacob said without hesitation. "Half Mexican. Helps with heavy work." The officer didn't look convinced. Another soldier approached from the tent, unfolding a crumpled piece of paper, a sketch. His eyes flicked between the drawing and the woman's face. "Sir," he said slowly, "this looks like the one from the bounty notice. Apache woman. Unusually large. Escaped from hunters 2 weeks back." The young officer's hand drifted toward his sidearm. "There's a reward for her return." The young officer drew his pistol, and the other 2 soldiers moved to flank them. Jacob's hand went to his rifle, but he knew the math. 3 armed men, trained and ready, versus 1 rancher and a woman who could barely stand from her injuries. There was no winning this fight. But before Jacob could say another word, she slid down from the horse. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and when her boots hit the ground, she didn't run. She didn't reach for a weapon. She walked straight toward the soldiers, her head held high despite the burns and the exhaustion carved into her face. Then she knelt. She extended her hands forward, wrists together, as if offering herself to be bound. The soldiers hesitated, confused by the surrender. "If I fight," she said, her voice steady and cold, "you will die. If I surrender, only I do." Jacob felt something crack open inside his chest. She wasn't afraid of them. She was afraid of herself, of what she believed she was. A weapon, a curse, something that destroyed everything it touched. He saw it then, clearer than he'd ever seen anything. She had spent her entire life believing that her existence was a problem, that the only way to protect people was to remove herself from their world. And she was about to do it again. Jacob's mind raced. He couldn't fight them. He couldn't outrun them. But maybe, just maybe, he could outsmart them. He turned toward the trees and shouted, loud enough to echo across the riverbank. "Marshal, got your fugitives right here. Federal bounty on all 3. The soldiers froze. The young officer's eyes darted toward the trees, then back to Jacob. "What are you?" "Marshal's been tracking bounty hunters operating without federal license," Jacob said quickly, his voice hard and certain. "You boys planning to collect on a federal wanted person without jurisdiction." The bluff hung in the air like smoke. The soldiers exchanged glances. One of them swore under his breath. The young officer holstered his pistol, his face flushed with anger and doubt. "This isn't over," he muttered. But they mounted their horses and rode off, disappearing into the brush. Jacob let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They reached the western ridge just as the first light broke over the mountains. Jacob expected emptiness, just open land and the long federal trail stretching toward the territories. But the father was already there, waiting beneath a stand of cottonwoods, 2 saddled horses grazing beside him. He'd followed them the entire way, staying just out of sight, ready to intervene if the soldiers had pressed harder. He approached slowly, carrying a leather pouch in one hand. Inside were tribal papers, documents marked with seals that would allow Jacob to escort her legally across territorial lines, a protection against both bounty hunters and federal patrols. The father handed them over without ceremony, then turned to Jacob with something close to gratitude in his tired eyes. "You were not chosen by destiny," he said quietly. "You chose yourself. That makes you the right one." Jacob nodded, unsure how to respond. The father stepped back, and for the first time since they'd left the ranch, the woman spoke without being asked. "If you wish me gone," she said, her voice softer now, almost hesitant, "I will go." Jacob looked at her, this woman who had thrown herself between him and bullets, who had knelt to spare others, who still believed her existence was something to apologize for. "If I wanted you gone," he said, meeting her eyes, "I wouldn't have crossed half the territory to keep you alive." Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but close. They didn't turn east toward the ranch. They didn't ride west toward the federal territories. Instead, they headed south, toward the trading camps near the border, where neither tribe nor settlers controlled the story, where size didn't make you a spectacle and survival didn't require permission. As they rode into the open valley, the sun rising behind them, Jacob realized they weren't running anymore. They were starting over, two unlikely partners, beginning a life neither of them had expected, but one they'd both chosen.